Hi, I'm Jennifer Sir from the Sewing Room. Today we're going to make a 2-layer mask with ties. To start, we're going to have a rectangle measuring 15.5 inches long by 7.5 inches wide, and 2 additional rectangles, each measuring 1.5 inches wide by 36 inches long. So we have 2 rectangles. Those are going to be the ties, and the big rectangle in the middle is going to be the mask. Let's get started. So we start with a rectangle. Here it is, and we put right sides together and stitch up the short sides with 1/4 of an inch seam. This is what it looks like after it's stitched up, and now I need to iron that seam open. You can do this on a full-size ironing board, but I just happen to have a small one here. I'm going to press open this 1/4 inch seam at the top edge of the mask. Then the mask gets turned right side out with the seam at one edge. We're going to press that seam, and then we'll press the other edge, a crease into the other edge of the mask. Now we have a nice creased rectangle with the right sides on the outside of the fabric. And next we need to mark our mask. We need to mark the pleats. So it's a series, the first time we pleat, it's a series of 4 marks. The first mark being 1.5 inches up from the bottom edge. We do the mark on both sides. I'm using a friction pen, which comes off when you iron it. You can use a water-soluble pen too. Then I'm doing another mark 1.5 inches away from that. Another mark 1 inch away from that second mark. And a final mark 1.5 inches away from the third mark up. Now, here you can see, we have a mark at 1.5, 1.5, 1, and 1.5. We have it in front of us, and we're going to do our pleats starting at the bottom edge, the edge closest to us. We're going to take that 1.5 inch mark, and we're going to move it up to the mark that, the second mark. And we're going to pin the edges in place. That creates our first pleat. Then we're going to go to the next mark, and that will be the top edge of our pleat. And we'll take that and move it to the top mark. And that gives us 2 pleats. Now we need to stitch those sides down. I'm using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on the edge. Needle came unthreaded. Speaking of needles, I think if you use a size 14 needle, you should be in pretty good shape because it'll go through the fabric, all the pleats, and won't give you any trouble over the binding. This is what your mask looks like. It has those two pleats, and I'm going to give it a quick press just so that those pleats lay down nicely. And I'm going to make one more set of marks for our final pleat. So with the pleats facing away from us on the front side, we're going to make a mark 7/8 inch up from that top pleat. And in this case, we don't have a separation between the top pleat and the final pleat. It's actually one pleat on top of the other. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that top pleat, and we're going to move that up to the mark, creating a pleat on top of a pleat. We'll do that on both sides, and then we'll stitch it in place. And it will look a little bit like this. So it's a pleat on top of a pleat. I'm using the same seam allowance, 1/4 inch. And I'm stitching it on both sides. And I'll give it one more press. Your mask should look like this at this point. It'll have one pleat at the bottom, and then it has another pleat with a pleat behind it right here at the top. We're going to place that aside just for a moment, and I'm going to talk about the ties and how you have to prepare them. So to prepare your ties, you want to first start by pressing the edges back the short edges back about 3/8 of an inch. So you can see I've pressed it back about 3/8 of an inch on both ends. And then you're going to press the edges to the middle. So this is what it is when it's flat. Here it is opened up. We press these two sides to the center, and then after you get that pressed all the way down and you've done both of your ends, so you have clean finished edges, then you're going to press it again one more time so that the long edges match. Here you go. Let's see if I can focus. Okay, so once you have your ties prepared, and your mask is ready for the ties, then you're going to make a mark. I usually just do it with a pin at the center of the tie. So I'm finding the center of the ties, and I'm bringing my mask in front of me, and then what I'm doing is I'm unfolding the binding and putting the raw edges against the raw edges of the mask. And, oh, I skipped one step. Let's stop. First, before before we put the ties on, we're gonna stop here and we're going to trim the edges. So this really helps the binding look better in the end. So I'm just trimming these edges to about 1/8 of an inch. And I do it on both sides. Now when I say 1/8 of an inch, I mean like 1/8 of an inch from the stitch line. So the stitch line is our guideline basically. And it will be completely covered up once we put the binding on. So we have our center marked on our binding, and we want to center that on the center of the side mask. And I put 3 pins in. I get it pinned sort of at the top of the mask, the center of the mask, and then at the bottom of the mask. And then I turn it around and I do the other side. So again, I find the center of my strap, my ties. I mark it with a pin, just by pinning it through just a few threads, really. Then I open up my binding and bring that raw edge to the raw edge of the mask and pin it in the center. And pin it at the sides like this. Now it's time to stitch those in place at 1/4 of an inch. And I'm taking the pins out as I go. Okay. Here is what our mask looks like at this point. So this is the back side, and you can see that we still have raw edges showing. And this is the front side here. So I'm going to lay the mask flat with the back side up and the raw edges showing, and I'm going to wrap that binding that we just created around that raw edge, covering up the stitches, and pin in place. Now it's time to sew the ties. Some of you may feel like you need to pin the ties completely, but I don't really pin the ties. I just make sure that it's nice and tidy at the end before I get started and when I get to the end of the other tie. So I'm starting at the end of the binding, and since it's kind of thick, sometimes it's easier if you start a little more forward on the tie and then backstitch first before you go forward. Also, we're sewing about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, and that will help make sure that we get all of both sides of the binding so that if they're not matched up perfectly at the edges, that it will still catch both when we sew it. So I'll start with my back stitch, and then should have probably taken the pins out instead of sewing over them. Once you get to the end and you backstitch, then you can actually grab your other tie end and making sure it's nice and tidy at the top. That's kind of the hardest bit, is just making sure it's nice and tidy at the top. And then I'm just going to butt that up to the other tie. Get my backstitching in. And continue down the other side of the tie. Slowing down when I get to the mask and taking my pins out as I go. So once you get to the end, clip your threads and you are done. So exciting. So there you have it. We have our finished mask with ties on each end and a nice expanding center. Thank you so much for watching. If you like the video, please give us a thumbs up and a follow. It really helps us out. Have a great day.